In the year 1004, a Byzantine princess sat down at her wedding banquet in Venice and did something nobody at that table had ever seen. She ate with a small, golden, two-pronged tool instead of her fingers. The reaction wasn't admiration, it was outrage. A priest later wrote that her arrogance is what brought her premature death from plague divine punishment, apparently, for refusing to eat like a normal human being. That object she was mocked for. It's sitting in your kitchen drawer right now, and you've probably never thought about it twice. That's the thing about the fine dining table. Every single ritual we now consider elegant started out as something controversial, dangerous, or flat out forbidden. Today, we're going all the way back to trace how dinner went from eating off bread with your bare hands to white tablecloths, tasting menus, and a Frenchman who basically wrote the rulebook every five-star restaurant still follows. Let's get into it. Long before anyone used the phrase fine dining, eating in public was never really about food. It was about power. In ancient Greece and Rome, banquets were essentially political theater. Feasts were woven into religious life, social status, and politics. Hosting the right people with the right amount of excess could make or break a person's standing in society. Romans reclined on couches instead of sitting in chairs, ate with their hands, and used small fork-like tools, mostly just to handle shellfish or pull meat off a fire, not as everyday cutlery, but as practical kitchen gadgets. Then we jump forward to medieval Europe, and the dining table becomes even more theatrical and, honestly, a little brutal by today's standards. There were no plates as we know them. Instead, people ate off trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up meat juices and sauces. Two people would often share a single trencher between them, which meant table manners weren't just about looking polished. They were survival skills for not annoying the person eating off the same piece of bread as you. Cutlery was minimal. Everyone carried their own personal knife because restaurants and households simply didn't supply one. Spoons were common too, but mostly for broths and soft food. The wealthy had metal spoons, while everyone else made do with wood. And forks. They barely existed in most of Europe. At Benedictine monasteries, meals were eaten in near silence while a monk read scripture aloud, a rule written around the year 530 that's honestly more disciplined than most modern dinner parties. But here's the twist: table manners weren't really about etiquette for etiquette's sake. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed that the way you ate revealed your moral character. Leaning over your bowl, talking with food in your mouth, tearing meat too aggressively, these weren't just rude. They were seen as signs of a flawed soul. Courtesy books from the 12th century actually warned young nobles against exactly this kind of behavior because bad table manners could damage your reputation for life. So let's go back to that doomed Byzantine princess for a second, because her story isn't an isolated weird moment. It's actually the opening chapter of one of the strangest object histories in human civilization. Forks had quietly existed in the Byzantine world for a couple of centuries before her wedding, but Western Europe wanted nothing to do with them. A respected German mystic in the 12th century is even said to have called the fork godless. For roughly 400 years after that scandalous Venice wedding, Europeans largely stuck to spoons, knives, and their own 10 fingers. The fork's real comeback started in Italy, and weirdly, we have pasta to thank for it. By the 1300s, wealthy Italian merchants discovered that eating slippery noodles with a knife or spoon was a losing battle but a pronged little tool. Perfect. Once Italians realized forks were useful for pasta, they started using them for everything else too. From there, the fork crossed Europe almost like a fashion trend smuggled in by royal marriages. Catherine de' Medici reportedly brought silver forks and Italian dining customs into the French court when she married into French royalty, alongside chefs, perfumers, and ingredients the French had never seen before, like artichokes. Decades later, an English traveler named Thomas Coriat came back from Italy in the early 1600s, telling everyone about this clever eating tool, and his own countrymen mocked him relentlessly for it. Using a fork in England at that time wasn't sophisticated. It was seen as pretentious, almost feminine, and more than a little ridiculous. It genuinely took until the 1700s for fork use to become standard etiquette across most of Europe, and even longer in places like North America, where forks weren't widely used at dinner tables until the 1800s. Funny enough, the design problem was real too early. Forks had just two straight prongs, and food kept sliding right off. It wasn't until the French refined the design with four curved tines in the late 1600s that the fork finally started working the way we expect it to today. Now here's where the story takes its biggest turn, because the concept of fine dining, as we understand it, didn't come from royal palaces at all. It came from a revolution that destroyed them. Before the late 1700s, there wasn't really such a thing as a restaurant in the modern sense. If you wanted a proper meal away from home, you went to a tavern or an inn, sat at a long communal table with strangers, and ate whatever the house was serving that day. No menu, no choice, no privacy. That changed in 1765 when a man in Paris named Boulanger opened a small business selling soups and broths marketed as restorative health food, which is actually where the word restaurant comes from. It wasn't fancy, but it planted a seed. The real explosion happened after the French Revolution. When the aristocracy collapsed, all the elite private chefs who used to cook exclusively for kings, dukes, and wealthy households suddenly found themselves unemployed. So what did many of them do? They opened their own restaurants, and for the first time, the general public could walk in and eat the exact same refined, elegant food that used to be reserved for royalty. These new restaurants introduced things that feel completely normal to us now, but were genuinely revolutionary back then. Private tables instead of shared communal benches, the ability to actually reserve a table in advance, fine china, real tablecloths, and maybe most importantly, a menu where you could choose your own dish instead of eating whatever was put in front of you. By the early 1800s, Paris had gone from fewer than 50 restaurants before the Revolution to literally thousands. Escoffier is widely considered the most influential chef in culinary history. And honestly, almost everything you associate with a high-end restaurant kitchen today traces back to him. He organized professional kitchens into a structured hierarchy, what's still called the brigade system, with different chefs assigned to specific stations instead of total chaos in the kitchen. He also streamlined French sauces down to a foundational set that culinary schools still teach as the building blocks of cooking. But Escoffier didn't do it alone. He partnered with hotelier César Ritz, who understood something Escoffier didn't focus on as much: atmosphere, decor, and the overall experience of feeling like royalty for one evening, even if you weren't. Together, they helped transform fine dining from just really good food into a complete immersive event involving service, presentation, ambiance, and even the unspoken theater of how a waiter approaches your table. Around this same era, another shift was happening in how food was even served. The older French-style service à la française meant every dish was placed on the table at once, like a massive buffet. But a new method called service à la Russe slowly took over. Courses served one at a time, individually plated in careful sequence. That's the dining rhythm we still follow today: starter, then main, then dessert, instead of everything arriving in one overwhelming spread. So when you walk into a fine dining restaurant today, white tablecloths, a server explaining the tasting menu, a precise sequence of small, artfully plated courses, you're not just enjoying a meal. You're sitting at the end of an absurdly long chain of history. You're tasting the leftover ambition of French royal courts, the discipline of Escoffier's kitchen brigades, the revolutionary idea that the public deserved restaurant-quality food, and yes, the eventual hard-won acceptance of a tiny pronged tool that one priest swore was sent straight from hell. Next time you pick up your fork without a second thought, just remember, for most of human history, that simple gesture would have gotten you talked about for centuries. If you enjoyed this dive into the secret history hiding behind your dinner table, make sure you're subscribed, because we're peeling back the curtain on the everyday objects and rituals you've never thought twice about, and trust me, the stories only get stranger from here.